It was the summer of 1995, and I was 10 years old, fresh into my first year of Cub Scouts. That year, the troop leader decided we should ease into camping by doing a backyard setup at his house. He had a huge yard that backed up to some woods, and it seemed like the perfect way to start. My parents were thrilled. I was finally doing something social, and they didn't have to drive me far. There were about 12 of us, split into groups of 3, each with our own little tents. I was sharing a tent with 2 boys I'd known from school, Ben and Tyler. We weren't close friends, but we got along well enough. The 3 of us had the cheapest tent out of the bunch, just a little dome tent my dad had picked up on clearance. It was cramped, but we were kids and didn't care. The evening started out great. We roasted marshmallows over a small fire, learned some basic knots, and played tag until it got dark. The troop leader's wife brought out a tray of cookies, and we scarfed them down like we hadn't just eaten dinner. By the time we crawled into our tents, we were still buzzing with energy. Ben, Tyler, and I lay on our sleeping bags, whispering and laughing about who would get a merit badge first or which one of us could survive a bear attack. The troop leader had told us to quiet down, but we didn't take it seriously. It felt like the kind of night that could stretch on forever. Then we heard the noise. At first, it was faint, a rustling sound outside the tent. We froze, listening. Ben whispered something about raccoons, but Tyler said it could be a bear. I didn't think it was either. It sounded too deliberate, like someone walking slowly through the grass, trying not to be noticed. The sound grew closer. We clutched our sleeping bags, staring at the thin fabric of the tent. The moonlight cast faint shadows, and I swore I saw something move past. None of us said a word now. We just waited, barely breathing. And then, just as quickly as it started, the rustling stopped. The silence was worse somehow, stretching out like a rubber band about to snap. I glanced at Ben and Tyler. Their eyes were wide, their faces pale. That's when it happened. The tent zipper flew open. We screamed, but before we could react, a hand holding an axe came swinging down. The blade caught Ben square on the top of his head. I can still hear the dull thunk it made, still see the way he froze, his eyes going wide with shock. Blood started streaming down his forehead, bright red in the dim light. Tyler and I scrambled backward, pressing ourselves against the far wall of the tent. Ben didn't move. He just sat there, staring at us, his face slack, like he couldn't quite process what had happened. The person holding the axe, some teenager I didn't recognize, stood there for a moment, looking as shocked as we were. Then he dropped the axe and bolted. I don't remember screaming, but I must have, because the next thing I knew, adults were everywhere. Someone was shouting for an ambulance. Someone else was trying to comfort Ben, who hadn't moved or said a word. Blood was pooling around him now, soaking into the tent floor. Tyler and I were pulled out and hustled into the house. The rest of the night was a blur. The ambulance came and Ben was taken away. The rest of us sat in the living room, wrapped in blankets, eating cookies we didn't want and listening to calming music. The troop leader's wife kept telling us it was all going to be okay, but I didn't believe her. We never saw Ben again. His family moved away a few weeks later, and no one in the troop talked about it after that night. It was like we all agreed to pretend it didn't happen. But it did happen, and it changed me. I couldn't shake the image of Ben sitting there, blood running down his face, staring at me like I was supposed to fix it. I didn't camp again for a long time. When I finally did, it was because my older brother had become an Eagle Scout. He had all these stories about camping trips. Funny, exciting stories that made it seem like the best thing in the world. I wanted to be like him, so I gave it another shot. But it wasn't the same. Every rustle in the bushes, every crack of a twig, sent my heart racing. Couldn't relax. While my friends laughed and joked around the campfire, I sat stiff and quiet, waiting for something bad to happen. Over time, I got better at pretending. I even started enjoying some trips, but the fear never really went away. It just sat there under the surface, waiting for a reason to come back. And sometimes it did, like the time I came home early from a campout in high school. It was 1 a.m., and I hadn't told my parents I was coming back. I walked into the house, tired and annoyed, only to find myself staring down the barrel of my dad's gun. He thought I was an intruder. If my mom hadn't stopped him, he might have shot me. Or the time my friends and I got caught in a storm while sailing to a camping spot. We ended up on the wrong island, sleeping on a concrete slab under a pavilion. I spent half the night replaying the moment I almost fell overboard, imagining how cold and dark the water would have been. Then there was the snow caving trip on Mount Rainier. Our poorly built cave nearly collapsed on us, and we spent the night shivering in exposed sleeping bags, too cold to sleep. By morning, my ski pants were frozen solid, and I couldn't even put them on. Camping was supposed to be about fun and adventure, but for me, it was always tinged with something darker, something dangerous. I kept doing it, though, because I wanted to prove to myself that I could. Now, as an adult, I still camp occasionally, but I'm more careful. I double-check my gear, choose my spots wisely, and always keep an eye on my surroundings. I've learned that the outdoors can be unpredictable and that people can be, too. I'll never forget that first camping trip in the backyard, though. It set the tone for everything that came after. And no matter how many times I go out into the wilderness, a part of me is always waiting for the zipper to fly open, for the axe to come down. I've been hiking and camping for years, and like most outdoor enthusiasts, I've got a few stories that still make my skin crawl when I think about them. The first one happened when I was in my mid-20s around 2012 on a remote section of the Appalachian Trail in Virginia. I had taken some time off work for a solo hiking trip, something I'd been wanting to do for a while, but hadn't yet found the courage to attempt. It wasn't a popular section of the trail, and for the most part, I was alone. I remember feeling like this trail was mine, like I had it all to myself, which was exactly what I wanted. The morning of the incident started like any other. I woke up at sunrise, packed my bag with the bare essentials, and set off. I moved fast, trying to make the most of the cooler temperatures before the heat of the day kicked in. It was a quiet, peaceful kind of day. The air was still, the birds were chirping, and the trail was narrow, winding through dense woods that seemed to swallow everything around me. I'd been hiking for hours, not really noticing how far I'd gone. Every so often, I'd stop to take a drink, have a quick snack, and listen to the sounds of the woods. But then I came around a sharp bend in the trail, and there it was. I didn't even notice at first, the bear. I had just rounded the corner and, out of the corner of my eye, saw some movement. My brain didn't register what it was at first, but then it clicked. I froze, suddenly realizing I was about 20 feet away from a black bear. It wasn't huge, but still, it was big enough to make me feel like I was in a dangerous situation. We both just stared at each other for what felt like an eternity. Its eyes were dark, unblinking, and its ears flicked back nervously as it slowly took a few steps back. I could hear my heart pounding in my ears. For a moment, I forgot everything I'd read or learned about bear encounters. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My feet were cemented to the ground. The bear, thankfully, seemed just as startled as I was. Probably hadn't expected anyone to be out there either. But we were both stuck, locked in this awkward, silent standoff. After what felt like forever, I remembered what you're supposed to do in situations like this. You have to make yourself seem bigger, louder, and more intimidating. I wasn't exactly a seasoned wilderness expert, but I had enough common sense to know not to run. I raised my arms above my head and screamed at the top of my lungs, hoping to scare it off. I was yelling at it like a madman, jumping around, making as much noise as I could. Thankfully, it worked. The bear, startled by my outburst, turned around and bolted into the underbrush, disappearing into the trees like it had never been there. My hands were shaking so badly I had to lean against a nearby tree to steady myself. I don't think I even took a breath until I was sure the bear was long gone. I continued down the trail, still shaken, but also strangely proud of myself. I'd survived the encounter and had done exactly what I was supposed to do. But even as I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. That bear hadn't been the only one out there in those woods. It wasn't the last time I'd feel the cold grip of fear on that hike. But the real story, what really shook me, happened a few years later on a completely different camping trip. Fast forward to 2016. I was on a road trip with my friend Ben. We'd been planning this trip for months. The goal was to car camp our way through the southwestern United States. We had permits to camp in some of the more remote national parks, and we'd mapped out our route carefully. One of our stops was Great Sand Dunes National Park in Colorado, a place I'd always wanted to visit. We got there late in the afternoon, with a storm rolling in. The air was thick with electricity, and we could feel the static in our hair. The sky was dark, heavy with clouds, and we were already feeling the first drops of rain when we made it to our campsite. We quickly set up our tent and threw on our rain gear, but just as we were securing the last of our things, the wind picked up. It wasn't just a little gust, it was like the sky itself was coming undone. The wind was howling, the sand was blowing in all directions, and we both scrambled to get our things inside the tent as quickly as possible. The storm hit with a ferocity I wasn't prepared for. The rain came down in sheets, and the wind felt like it was trying to rip the tent from the ground. I had never been in a storm like that before. It felt like nature itself was fighting against us, trying to push us out of that place. The tent buckled and groaned under the pressure of the wind. We had to hold the poles up with our backs, pressing as hard as we could against the sides to keep it from collapsing. At one point, I thought the whole tent might blow away with us still inside. I tried to sleep, but I couldn't. The noise, the pressure, the sense that the storm could take us at any moment kept me wide awake. I couldn't help but wonder if we'd made a huge mistake by choosing to camp here in the first place. Hours passed, and the storm showed no signs of letting up. I remember hearing the sand scraping against the tent like thousands of tiny nails, the constant rattle of the rain hitting the fabric. The thunder was so loud it rattled my bones, and the flashes of lightning made everything seem unnatural. Ben and I kept our heads down, trying to stay calm, but neither of us could sleep. There was no way. All I could think about was the sheer power of nature and how helpless we were in the face of it. The night dragged on like that, a never-ending cycle of fear and exhaustion. We held the tent in place for what felt like hours, and by the time the storm started to ease up, I was so drained that I could barely move. When the wind finally calmed, we sat in silence, listening to the soft patter of rain on the canvas. I don't think either of us said a word. It was just too much. Eventually, the storm subsided, and the air was still again. The morning light broke through the clouds, revealing the destruction left behind. The sand had shifted, the dunes had changed, and the world felt different somehow. We packed up as quickly as we could, both of us eager to leave the site that had felt like it was trying to swallow us whole. That night, as I lay in my sleeping bag in a safer spot, I couldn't help but reflect on how small we really are out there, how little control we have over the land, the weather, and everything else in the wilderness. I've camped in a lot of different places since then, but I still remember those two incidents like they happened yesterday. They were a reminder of how quickly things can go from peaceful to terrifying when you're out there alone, in the middle of nowhere. Nature doesn't care who you are. It's indifferent to your plans, your safety, or your comfort. It doesn't owe you anything, and when you forget that, it can humble you in the most terrifying ways. The wilderness isn't your friend, and those experiences will stay with me forever. I've always loved camping, but this particular trip is burned into my memory as a night I'll never forget for all the wrong reasons. It was about 15 years ago at a popular campground near Bryce Canyon. The campground was packed with people. It was summer, and everyone seemed to have the same idea to spend the weekend outdoors. I was with my boyfriend at the time, Jake, and we had one of those ultralight tents with a netted top. It was perfect for stargazing, and that night the sky was absolutely clear. We set up camp late in the afternoon and had dinner at the picnic table by our site. I remember feeling relaxed, even though the place was buzzing with activity. Kids were running around, laughter echoed from neighboring campsites, and the smell of campfire smoke drifted through the air. It felt safe, too safe, maybe, and that's what made everything that happened so much more unsettling. When it got dark, we climbed into our tent and lay there for a while, staring up at the stars through the netted top. Jake fell asleep quickly, as he always did, but I stayed up a little longer, just enjoying the night sounds and the cool breeze. Sometime in the middle of the night, I was startled awake by the sound of footsteps. At first, I thought it was just a deer or some other animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too heavy. It was the kind of sound that immediately puts you on edge, like your body knows something's not right before your brain does. The footsteps grew louder, and then they stopped, right next to the tent. My heart was pounding in my chest as I tried to rationalize what I was hearing. Maybe it was someone walking back to their own campsite and didn't realize how close they were to ours. I held my breath, listening, but whoever it was didn't move. They just stood there. I couldn't see much through the netting, just the vague outline of someone leaning down, looking into the tent. I froze, not sure what to do. It felt like forever, but it was probably only a few seconds before I finally managed to force out a loud, "Hey!" The figure straightened up quickly and walked away, disappearing into the darkness. My heart was racing, and I felt a mix of fear and anger. Who just walks up to someone's tent like that? I got up, threw on some clothes, and shook Jake awake to tell him what happened. He mumbled something about it probably being nothing and went back to sleep. I was too freaked out to stay in the tent, so I grabbed my flashlight and went to sit in the car. From the driver's seat, I had a clear view of our campsite. The campground was still somewhat active. I could see a few people milling around and the glow of campfires in the distance. That should have made me feel safer, but it didn't. I kept scanning the area, my eyes darting to every shadow and movement. After a while, I thought I saw something, or someone, moving near the back of our site. It was just a flicker of motion, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I kept watching, and sure enough, someone crept out of the shadows and approached our tent again. They moved slowly, cautiously, like they didn't want to be seen. I was paralyzed with fear, unsure of what to do. As soon as they got close to the tent, they stopped and then quickly walked away just like before. I wanted to scream, to run out and confront them, but I was too scared. Instead, I got out of the car and tried to wake Jake again, but he brushed me off, saying I was overreacting. I felt like I was losing my mind. Was I imagining things? Was this some kind of prank? I went back to the car, locking the doors and gripping the steering wheel like it was some kind of lifeline. A little while later, I saw a man walking down the main road of the campground. He was carrying a flashlight, and as he passed our site, he turned and shone it directly into my face through the car window. He held it there for a few seconds, long enough to make my skin crawl, and then kept walking. That was the breaking point for me. I jumped out of the car, shouting for Jake to get up. I told him we needed to leave, that this wasn't safe, but he still didn't seem to grasp the seriousness of the situation. I didn't care. I wasn't staying there another second. I started packing up the essentials, throwing them into the car haphazardly. Jake finally got up, annoyed but willing to help. We left most of our stuff behind and drove out of the campground, my hands shaking on the steering wheel. We ended up pulling over on the side of the road a few miles away, too tired to keep driving. I didn't sleep much, constantly checking the rearview mirror and jumping at every noise. When morning came, we drove to Monument Valley. The sunrise was breathtaking, with the full moon still hanging low in the sky opposite the rising sun. For a moment, I almost forgot about the terror of the night before. Almost. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that whoever was creeping around our campsite wasn't just some curious camper or harmless prankster. They had a purpose, and I don't think it was anything good. I've camped many times since then, but I always make sure we're in a secure location, and I never let my guard down. Some lessons are learned the hard way. I never thought I'd be the one to find myself stuck in the middle of nowhere, at the edge of a remote forest, with nothing but the pale light of a dying campfire. But there I was, a 29-year-old factory worker, far from home, alone and questioning every decision that led me to that moment. It started simple enough. I was looking for a break from the noise of factory floors and constant machinery. My muscles ached from hours spent welding metal, and my mind had been running on autopilot for too long. I'd heard from a coworker about this quiet campsite nestled in the woods of northern Minnesota. He'd spoken about the area like it was some sort of peaceful retreat, perfect for people like me who just wanted to escape. So, I packed my things, grabbed my gear, and made the 4-hour drive on a Friday afternoon. The site was in a state park, but it felt like it was hidden in a way that made it feel almost private. No one else around. Just me and the trees, the dirt, the creek. I set up my tent, gathered firewood, and by nightfall, everything was perfect. The kind of silence that makes you feel like you're the only one alive in the world, broken only by the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of wind through the branches. But that night, something changed. The calmness turned to something darker. A slight unease lingered in the air, a subtle shift that I couldn't explain. It was like the shadows around the fire stretched a little too long, or the night sounds, cicadas, rustling leaves, the flow of the creek, stopped too suddenly. First, I brushed it off as nothing. Maybe it was the isolation getting to me, but as I sat there, staring into the flames, I began to feel like I wasn't truly alone. Not in the way you'd expect from a story about monsters or ghosts, but more like there was something or someone else nearby, just outside the edge of my vision. I couldn't explain it, but it felt like eyes were on me, watching, waiting. I told myself it was just nerves. I'd been cooped up in that factory too long, away from anything real. The fire crackled again, and I shrugged off the feeling. The chill of the night was creeping in, so I crawled into my tent, zipped it up tight, and tried to sleep. But sleep didn't come easy. Every few minutes, I'd wake up, heart pounding, drenched in sweat, like I'd heard something outside, a twig snapping, a distant footstep. But when I opened the tent flap, nothing was there. Just the dark, the trees, the wind. I finally drifted off somewhere around midnight, only to wake up to the sound of something different. It wasn't a bird or a bug or even the wind. It was something else. Something low, almost like a growl, but not quite. Not animal, but something primal, something dark. The noise came from deep in the forest, far off, but so loud it vibrated through my chest. I froze, not sure if I'd imagined it or if it was real. Then came another sound, a crack, like someone stepping on a branch, followed by a soft rustling. My heart raced. It was closer now. I reached for my flashlight, trying not to make any noise, and slowly unzipped the tent. I was careful, my hand shaking as I held the light out in front of me. There was nothing but darkness beyond the glow of the flashlight's beam. I strained my ears. Silence. Not even the wind. I stepped out of the tent, each footstep crunching on the dry ground. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and I could feel my pulse in my throat. I scanned the woods. The dark shadows of trees loomed around me, but there was no movement, no signs of anything. Yet, something inside me told me to go back to the tent, to just ignore it and wait until morning. But I didn't. I stood there, staring into the forest, trying to convince myself there was nothing out there. I was about to turn back when I heard it again, this time much closer. A soft shuffle of footsteps, slow, deliberate. I couldn't move. I didn't want to move. Then, just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. Complete silence. I stayed there, frozen for what felt like hours, waiting for something, anything to break the stillness. But nothing did. I retreated back into the tent, zipping it up with haste. My mind was racing, but my body was too tired to react. I lay there in the dark, staring up at the fabric of the tent, listening to the beating of my own heart. For the rest of the night, I didn't sleep a wink. Morning came, and I emerged from the tent, determined to pack up and leave. But as I stood outside, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, near the edge of my campsite, were footprints, barefoot prints, leading into the woods. The prints were fresh, the earth still soft from the night's dew. I bent down to inspect them, my breath caught in my throat. The prints were not animal, but human, and they were large, too large to be mine. The toes were splayed wide, like someone had been walking barefoot for a long time. There was no way anyone else had been here, not unless they'd been walking through the woods in the dead of night, barefoot. The realization hit me like a punch in the gut. I wasn't alone, not just in the woods, but here, at my campsite. I packed up quickly, tossing my gear into the car, eager to leave, but I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes on my back as I drove away. Even now, as I sit here writing this down, I can still feel the presence of whatever was out there. The thing that followed me through the woods. The thing that left its mark on the ground. It's like I've brought it with me, and I can never escape it. The road home was a blur, my mind racing with thoughts of what I'd seen. But it wasn't until later that night, when I pulled into my driveway and stepped out of the car, that I felt it again. That same sense of being watched. I looked around, my breath catching in my throat. There, in the shadows of my own driveway, stood a figure. Not close enough to be seen clearly, but I could feel it. Just out of reach, just beyond the light. I ran inside, locking the door behind me. And now, as I sit here writing this story, I can't shake the feeling that something is still out there. Something that followed me home. Maybe it's the woods. Maybe it's something darker. Something that's been out there long before I ever set foot in that forest. But whatever it is, I don't think it's finished with me yet. We'd been planning the camping trip for months. The three of us, me, my wife, Sarah, and her stepsister, Emily. It wasn't anything fancy, just a weekend getaway in the mountains near a small town, about 2 hours from our home. We'd rented a cabin for the weekend, with the idea that we'd hike, fish, and spend some time by the campfire. A chance for the three of us to disconnect and enjoy nature. I'm not usually the outdoors type, but I agreed. It had been a long time since Sarah had been able to get away, and Emily wasn't exactly one for socializing much either, so it seemed like the perfect opportunity to bond. We arrived around noon on a Friday. The weather was perfect, sunny but cool, with a slight breeze. The cabin was tucked into the trees, not too far from the trailhead. It was a small, rustic place with a stone fireplace and a porch that overlooked a stream. Not too bad. I could tell Sarah was excited, and Emily, despite her usual quietness, seemed content too. We spent the first couple of hours unpacking, setting up our gear, and preparing for a hike later. Sarah was in charge of the meals, as always, while Emily and I took care of the firewood. I remember Emily looking up at the trees as we walked into the woods. There was something strange about her expression, almost like she was watching something. But I didn't say anything. It was probably just me overthinking. As we got ready for the hike, Sarah pulled out the map. We were supposed to follow a marked trail that led up to a ridge with a breathtaking view. The kind of place you only get to see in movies. I led the way, with Sarah behind me and Emily bringing up the rear. We stayed close, but as we ventured deeper into the woods, I began to notice something odd. The trail wasn't as well maintained as the map had suggested. The markers were few and far between, and the path began to get a little rougher, winding through thick underbrush and overgrown bushes. It wasn't exactly the pleasant stroll I had expected. Still, we pressed on. It wasn't anything dangerous, just more challenging than anticipated. As the afternoon wore on, the sun started to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows over the trail. I suggested we head back, but Sarah wanted to keep going. She was determined to reach the ridge, and Emily, with her quiet, unspoken approval, seemed to be fine with it. We finally made it to a clearing just as the sun was setting. From here, you could see the entire valley below us, with the mountains surrounding everything like a natural fortress. It was beautiful, but something about the place felt off. Maybe it was the eerie silence that had settled in, or the way the trees seemed to close in on us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. We took a few pictures, tried to enjoy the view, but I couldn't stop looking over my shoulder. That feeling of being watched only grew stronger. It didn't make any sense. There wasn't anyone else around, just the three of us. We started to head back, but that's when we realized the trail was gone. The path we had followed earlier was no longer visible. I thought maybe we'd taken a wrong turn at some point, but I couldn't remember any fork in the trail. The dense trees and thick brush around us looked unfamiliar. We were disoriented, and as the light continued to fade, I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. I tried to stay calm. It wasn't a huge forest. We had to be close to the cabin, but after walking in circles for an hour, it became clear we weren't. Sarah was starting to get anxious, and Emily was growing quiet, like she was trying to process something. That's when we heard it. A twig snapped behind us. I froze. My heart raced. I turned, expecting to see someone or something coming out of the woods, but there was nothing. Just the darkening forest, the soft rustle of leaves, and the occasional snap of twigs underfoot. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or some other critter, but something in the back of my mind told me otherwise. We weren't alone. We kept walking, but the air was thick with tension. Every few minutes, I'd hear something. Another snap of a branch, a movement in the trees, but when I looked, there was nothing there. It was then that Emily stopped. She wasn't looking at us, but at something further down the trail, her gaze fixed in that direction like she saw something we didn't. I called to her, but she didn't answer. I walked over, but the moment I did, she quickly turned, pulling me toward the other side of the trail, away from whatever she'd been looking at. Something about her reaction sent a chill down my spine. "Let's just go back to the cabin," I said, my voice trying to sound calm. I could tell Sarah was starting to get scared too, but the further we walked, the worse it became. The woods were closing in around us, the shadows stretching long, the sounds of movement getting closer, but still no sign of anything. And then, in the distance, we heard something that didn't belong. A voice. It was faint, but it sounded like someone calling. I couldn't tell if it was human or just the wind, but the hair on the back of my neck stood up. We were too far out. The only way to get back was through the same woods we had just walked, and something in the pit of my stomach told me we shouldn't. We finally made the decision to turn back. By now, the night had fully settled in, and the only light we had was the small flashlight I'd been carrying. The trail was more overgrown than before, and the trees seemed to loom overhead like they were trying to swallow us whole. We stumbled forward, moving faster, heartbeats quickening as the sounds of the forest grew louder, more intense. And then it happened. We heard the sound again. The voice. This time it wasn't a call. It was a whisper. I looked at Sarah. She was pale, her breath shallow. Emily was already moving, her eyes darting around the trees, clearly disturbed by something. We kept moving faster, ignoring the path and just focusing on the direction that felt right. The air had a strange, metallic taste to it, and I could feel my pulse in my throat, beating louder than the sounds of the forest. The darkness around us was suffocating. The flashlight flickered, and for a brief moment, I saw something in the distance. Something tall, thin, and impossibly still. I couldn't make out any features, but the shape was enough to make my heart skip a beat. I grabbed Sarah's arm. She was breathing heavily now, shaking, and I could tell that Emily was just as frightened. I tried to reassure them, but I wasn't sure if I was convincing myself at that point. The rustling grew louder behind us, and we broke into a run. I wasn't sure what was chasing us, but I wasn't about to turn around to find out. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, we burst out of the woods. We were back at the clearing. The cabin was in sight, the warm light from the windows a beacon in the distance. We didn't stop until we were inside, the door slamming behind us. We were safe. That night, none of us could sleep. We kept hearing things. Soft tapping at the windows, the sound of footsteps outside. But when we looked, there was nothing. The next morning, the air was still. The sun was out, but the tension was thick between us. No one spoke much, but the unease in the air was palpable. We packed up quickly and left the cabin, the forest behind us as we headed back to the car. I still couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched. Something had been out there with us, and it wasn't anything natural. As we drove away, I kept looking in the rearview mirror. I half expected to see someone, or something, standing at the edge of the woods, watching us leave. But there was nothing, just trees, and a feeling I couldn't quite shake. We haven't been back since. It was a cold September evening when I decided to head out for a solo camping trip. I was 27 years old, and it had been a long time since I had ventured into the wild on my own. The area I chose was a remote forest in northern Washington, an area known for its breathtaking landscapes but also its unpredictability. I had done my research, so I thought I was prepared. But what I didn't know was that nature has a way of revealing things you're never prepared for. I loaded up my old truck, a 2008 Chevy Silverado, with camping gear and drove down the narrow, winding roads that led into the forest. The closer I got, the darker the sky became. The forecast had predicted clear skies, but nature had a mind of its own. By the time I reached the trailhead, the clouds had gathered thick overhead, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I was used to this. I had camped in worse weather in far more challenging conditions. I grabbed my backpack, slung it over my shoulders, and set off down the trail. The air had a damp, earthy smell to it, and the ground was soft underfoot from the rain that had fallen earlier in the day. The trees towered around me, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. Despite the dreariness, I felt calm, comfortable even, as I made my way deeper into the forest. I hadn't planned for any particular campsite. I was just going to find a good spot once I got there. After about an hour of walking, I found a small clearing by a creek. The sound of water trickling over rocks filling the silence felt peaceful. It was perfect, just far enough from the trail so that I wouldn't have to worry about any random hikers passing by, yet close enough to the creek for a fresh water source. I set up my tent quickly, unpacked my gear, and started a small fire with the dry wood I had collected from the surrounding trees. The fire crackled and popped as I sat down, the warmth slowly spreading through me. I made a simple dinner, ate quietly, and watched the flames dance in the growing darkness. It was one of those rare moments where the world seemed to slow down, where everything felt in place. As the evening wore on, the forest around me grew even darker, and the air became thick with moisture. The wind had started to pick up, howling through the trees, making the branches sway and creak. I thought nothing of it at first. The occasional gust was to be expected in the mountains. But as the hours passed, the wind began to take on a strange rhythm, almost like a low, distant growl. It wasn't a normal wind. I dismissed the thought as my imagination running wild. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I decided to turn in for the night, though sleep didn't come easily. The strange wind continued to howl outside, and the trees creaked as though they were whispering in some ancient language I couldn't understand. Sometime around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crack, like something snapping in the distance. It wasn't thunder or the wind. It was a sharp, distinct sound coming from somewhere deeper in the woods. I lay there in the dark, listening, straining my ears to catch any more sounds. My heart began to race as I tried to process what I had heard. The wind had died down, and the forest was eerily still. I reached for the flashlight beside my sleeping bag, flicked it on, and shone it out of the tent. The beam cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there. No movement, no shadows, just the silent trees standing like sentinels. I sat in the tent for a long time, my breath coming out in short, shallow gasps, trying to convince myself that I had imagined the whole thing. But then I heard it again. Another crack, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. It was far off, but I knew it wasn't an animal. It was too deliberate, too steady. My mind raced as I tried to make sense of it. Was someone out there? A hiker? A hunter? The idea of someone else being out in the forest didn't sit right with me. I hadn't seen a single soul on the trail, and I was at least several miles from the nearest road. It didn't make sense. The sounds continued, slow, deliberate footsteps, moving through the trees in a way that seemed too controlled, too calculated to be an animal. I grabbed my knife from my pack, feeling the weight of it in my hand as I waited. My mind began to race through all the worst-case scenarios, the ones I had heard about in the stories and the news. Someone out there lurking, watching, waiting. I couldn't stay inside the tent forever. I had to know what was going on. I slowly unzipped the door and crept outside, my eyes scanning the darkness. The fire had long since burned down to embers, casting only a faint glow. The air was cold against my skin, but I barely noticed. My ears strained to hear any further sounds, but the forest was quiet once again, as if the world had gone to sleep. I stepped carefully away from the tent, the ground soft beneath my boots. The moon, barely visible through the thick clouds, cast long, twisted shadows across the clearing. My heart was pounding in my chest, my breath coming in short, controlled bursts. I felt like I was being watched. I moved toward the edge of the clearing, keeping my flashlight low to the ground, its weak beam cutting through the night. The wind had picked up again, but it felt different now, colder, more forceful. Then, just as I reached the edge of the tree line, I saw something, a figure, standing motionless in the shadows, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I froze, my pulse racing. It was a man, standing still and silent, staring directly at me. His face was hidden in the dark, but I could see his outline clearly, tall, broad-shouldered, and unnaturally still. My mind screamed at me to run, to get back to the safety of the tent, but I couldn't move. Something kept me rooted to the spot, paralyzed by fear. Then, as quickly as it had appeared, the figure disappeared into the forest, moving with an unnatural speed, vanishing into the darkness. I stood there for a long time, too terrified to move, my heart hammering in my chest. The sound of footsteps was gone. The forest had returned to its eerie silence. I knew I couldn't stay there anymore. I couldn't be alone in that forest, not with whatever or whoever was out there. I grabbed my gear, packed up my tent in a rush, and left the clearing without a second thought. The cold air bit at my skin as I made my way back to the trail, my mind racing. I didn't care how far I had to walk. I just had to get out. The trail seemed longer now, the darkness pressing in on me from every direction. I didn't dare stop, not once. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves sent a fresh wave of panic through me. The wind howled through the trees, but it felt different now. It wasn't just the wind. It was something else, something that had been waiting for me in the woods. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, the headlights cutting through the darkness. I slammed the door shut behind me, locking it, and sat there, breathing heavily, trying to calm myself. My hands were shaking as I started the engine, the sound of the truck roaring to life breaking the silence. I didn't care how late it was or how tired I was. I wasn't staying there another minute. As I drove back down the winding road, the lights of the forest behind me began to fade into the distance. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following me, but there was nothing, just the road stretching out into the night. I never went back to that forest. Couldn't. There's something about that place, something that I can't explain, but that I'll never forget. I still wonder to this day what I saw that night and what it wanted. But some things are better left unanswered. I had gone out to find peace in nature, to find solitude and calm. What I found instead was something far more sinister, something that made me realize that no matter how prepared you are, nature always holds its secrets, and sometimes it's better not to know them. It was a late summer night in 2019 when I decided to go camping along the US-Mexico border. I was 28 at the time and wanted to escape the noise of the city. I'd been hearing a lot about people hiking and camping along the border for solitude or adventure, but I was mostly drawn to the wildness of it all. The idea of being completely alone in a place most people wouldn't dare go. So, I packed my gear, drove out to a remote area just south of Arizona, and set up camp. The place was barren, full of dry, cracked earth and sparse bushes. The sun had already set, casting the land in a strange, pale twilight. There was nothing for miles except desert, mountains, and the occasional rustle of wind through the brush. I set up my tent, made a small fire, and sat back to enjoy the peace. There were no sounds of civilization, no streetlights, no noise from cars or people, just the howling wind and the occasional scurry of animals. As night fell, the temperature dropped quickly, and the quiet was so thick it almost felt like the air was pressing in on me. I wrapped myself in a jacket and stared into the fire, listening to the crackling of the wood. I had read about people camping near the border, encountering border patrols or even illegal immigrants crossing, but I wasn't expecting any of that. I figured it would be a peaceful, solitary experience. But things started feeling off just a couple of hours after sunset. At first, it was nothing, just a shift in the air or the faint sound of something brushing against the ground. Maybe it was an animal, I thought. But then I started hearing footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, like someone was walking nearby, but not close enough for me to see them. I sat still, trying to figure out where they were coming from, but the sound would stop and start, as if whoever it was moving around in circles. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or maybe a distant hiker, though I knew better. No one else would be out here. I was as far from civilization as I could get. I checked my surroundings, making sure my gear was secure, but I didn't want to make any noise by turning on my flashlight. I listened closely for a few minutes, but the footsteps stopped. Then, I heard something else. Faint whispers in the wind, like someone was talking in a language I couldn't understand, sent a chill down my spine. I stood up from my seat, trying to locate the source. My mind raced. Was it just the wind again? My heart began to beat faster. The longer I stood there, the less sure I was about what was happening. I grabbed my flashlight and swept it across the dark landscape. Nothing. The only thing in the beam of light was the desert stretching for miles. But the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and the whispers came again, clearer this time. It sounded like multiple voices. They weren't coming from any one direction. They seemed to be all around me, carried by the wind. I froze. I was alone, miles away from anyone, and yet it felt like someone, or something, was out there with me. I quickly shut off the flashlight, crouching down in the dark. My mind raced with possibilities, but none of them made sense. Maybe someone was out there, someone trying to cross the border. But the more I listened, the more I realized they weren't the sounds of a person. They were too faint, too scattered. The air had become thick, almost suffocating. I couldn't hear the usual sounds of the desert anymore. The rustling of rodents, the occasional night bird, nothing. There was only silence and those whispers, distant but unmistakable. My instincts told me I needed to leave, but I had no idea which direction to go. The only thing I knew was that I was far too far from help. Suddenly, there was a loud rustling from the bushes near my campsite. It was so close that my heart nearly stopped. I grabbed my backpack and unzipped it to pull out my knife, but I didn't dare turn on the flashlight. I couldn't risk alerting whoever or whatever was out there. The rustling stopped as suddenly as it started, but the sense of something watching me didn't go away. I backed up to the edge of my camp, eyes darting around in the darkness. A pair of glowing eyes appeared in the distance, too far for me to make out any details, but I knew something was watching me, something large. I held my breath and waited. It was still like the land itself was holding its breath. The eyes moved, slowly, deliberately. Then the whispers came again. They were closer now, as if the voices were just on the other side of the bushes, speaking in hushed tones, barely audible, like they were trying to remain hidden. But the longer I waited, the louder the voices grew. I gripped the knife tighter, my hands sweating despite the cold. I knew I had to get out. I had no idea what was out there, but the longer I stayed, the more certain I became that it wasn't something I wanted to encounter. I moved slowly toward the edge of my camp, still crouched low to the ground, my heart racing. The fire had died down to a few glowing embers, casting strange shadows around me. Then, just as I was about to make a run for it, I heard the unmistakable sound of heavy breathing, like something or someone was standing right behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there, only the endless desert stretching out before me. I wasn't sure how long I stood there, paralyzed with fear. My mind screamed for me to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I knew there was something in the shadows, something that didn't belong here. My flashlight had fallen from my pack earlier, and now it lay just beyond reach, useless in the dark. It was then that I saw it, something moving in the distance. At first, it looked like a shadow, but as it grew closer, I realized it was a person. A tall, thin figure, wearing dark clothing, moving with strange, jerky movements. I didn't dare move, but my eyes locked on the figure. My mind screamed at me to run, to get out of there, but I was frozen in place. The figure kept moving toward me, but it was almost as if it was walking in slow motion. There was no sound, no footsteps, just the occasional rustle of air. And then, with a sharp intake of breath, I saw more. A few more figures, scattered across the desert, slowly approaching. There were at least 5, all moving toward me with that same eerie stillness. I couldn't tell if they were people or something else entirely. Panic set in. I needed to leave, but my legs wouldn't cooperate. My head was spinning. Everything I had read about remote camping in dangerous areas flashed through my mind, People talking about smugglers, illegal immigrants, and cartel activity. I was not equipped for any of that. Not out here, alone in the middle of nowhere. I finally broke free of the paralysis, grabbing my gear in a wild scramble and running in the opposite direction, towards the edge of the camp. I didn't know which way was safe, but I couldn't stay there any longer. My heart was pounding in my chest as I ran, adrenaline coursing through my veins. I tripped over rocks and shrubs, but I kept going, not daring to look behind me. I didn't stop until I reached my truck, jumping inside and slamming the door shut. I started the engine without even thinking, my hands shaking as I gripped the wheel. My mind raced, but I couldn't make sense of it all. What had I seen? Who were those figures? Were they just figments of my imagination? Or had I truly stumbled into something dangerous? I didn't stay around to find out. I drove off, leaving the dark, silent desert behind me. I didn't feel safe until I was hours away from that place, and even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something had been out there in the dark, watching me, waiting for me to make a mistake. And to this day, I can't help but wonder if those whispers, those figures, were truly human or something much worse. But I never went back to the border. Never, and I never will.